you've got a fully staffed medical wing between the East Wing and the West Wing of the White House, with doctors, nurses, everything else 24/7. It seems to me inconceivable that it could have got to a stage 4 prostate cancer.
I guess the point is that anything now has caught the Democrats on the back foot because they are having a problem, I think, arguing that Biden would have been fine as president for another 4 years if he had decided to stand.
Some of those people really do need to answer some pretty searching questions about why they thought it would be okay for him to run for a second term.
Do you want to respond to President Biden being diagnosed with cancer? Are you going to call your predecessor?
I think it's very sad, actually. I'm surprised that it wasn't, the public wasn't notified a long time ago, because to get to stage 9, that's a long time. I just had my physical. You saw that. You saw the results of that particular test. I think that test is standard to pretty much anybody getting a physical, good physical. We had the doctors at the White House and over at Walter Reed, which is a fantastic hospital. I did a very complete physical, including cognitive test. I'm proud to announce I aced it.
Innate to any narcissist is the ability to turn a question about somebody else into a long, rambling statement about oneself. That was Donald Trump, who was asked about Joe Biden's cancer diagnosis, telling us in his inimitable way that the public should have been notified earlier. Is he suggesting the whole thing was a cover-up?
And the Twitter sphere is alive with conspiracy theory about this. But have the Democrats contributed to it by their lack of candour before the election about the true state of Joe Biden's physical and mental health? Welcome to the Newsagents USA.
The Newsagents USA.
It's Emily.
It's John.
And it didn't take very long, really, for those well-wishing tweets and thoughts to turn into something...
morph into something else.
Yeah, darker and more questioning and more suggestive of both cover-up and conspiracy. So let us lay out for you what we know. We know that Joe Biden has just been diagnosed with stage 4. Trump called it stage 9. That obviously isn't a stage 9 in cancer terms. We know that it's a cancer, or we're told that it's a cancer that has metastasized into his bone, and we know that he is also being treated for it, and that they hope that there is some kind of palliative care, even though it is not curable. But we also know that this has started, perhaps inevitably, a whole chain of commentary that suggests that Biden was somehow trying to cover up a stage 4 cancer whilst he was in the White House and only releasing it now, or not getting checked until now. There are a lot of people who've suddenly become overnight oncologists saying, well, actually, there's no way that you could not know about stage 4 cancer until now, even though we know that in older men, they tend not to have the PSA test for prostate cancer in later years because there are so many other things that can be part of the diagnosis.
So every instinct in my body, when I hear a conspiracy theory being enunciated, is to think it's bullshit. This is all just made up. Come on, why can't you just stick with the obvious evidence that is in front of you? But the timing of the release of this comes just a couple of days before the publication of the book by Jake Tapper, calling into question whether Joe Biden's mental fitness had deteriorated to such an extent that he couldn't have possibly run for office again, and should have been more candid about it, and those around him should have been more candid about it beforehand. So was this an attempt to spike the guns of Jake Tapper with this big book that was being released? Well, that's one theory. There were undoubtedly things where the White House was not candid about his condition and his mental acuity, and that again has fed the conspiracy theorists to raise these questions. So honestly, I do sort of think that it's probably just as straightforward as it seems, but it's hard to believe that someone who has as many physicals, has many medical examinations as a serving president, you've got a fully staffed medical wing between the East Wing and the West Wing of the White House with doctors, nurses, everything else 24/7. It seems to me inconceivable that it could have got to a stage 4 prostate cancer without any checks having been taken over the preceding months and years.
Yeah, but it's also inconceivable that you would allow your cancer to develop to stage 4 if you could choose to cure it.
Sure,
right? I mean, the whole thing makes no sense. But there is a doctor who is now in, the MAHA firing line. His long-term doctor, Kevin O'Connor, he has repeatedly assured the public that Biden was healthy, that he could have served another 4 years. So I guess the questions are being aimed at him now. Did you know the state of his health and cover it up, or did you not know the state of his health, in which case how on earth do you get to stage 4 cancer so quickly? You can, of course. I mean, you can, in an old man, you can be taken by surprise with something that has developed much more quick. I would know this from my own family and all the rest of it. But I guess the point is that anything now has caught the Democrats on the back foot because they are having a problem, I think, arguing that Biden would have been fine as president for another 4 years if he had decided to stand.
And I said a moment ago that the Twitter sphere is alive with conspiracy theory. It's not just kind of random nutters on the Twitter sphere who are doing this stuff. Some of it is just quietly being seeded by people with significant influence, not least the Vice President, J.D. Vance.
We really do need to be honest about whether the former president was capable of doing the job. And that's no, that you can separate the desire for him to have the right health outcome with the recognition that whether it was doctors or whether there were staffers around the former president, I don't think he was able to do a good job for the American people. And that's not politics. That's not because I disagreed with him on policy. That's because I don't think that he was in good enough health. In some ways, I blame him less than I blame the people around him. And why didn't the American people have a better sense of his health picture? Why didn't the American people have more accurate information about what he was actually dealing with? This is serious stuff.
I mean, weirdly, we've now got CNN's Jake Tapper, one of the co-authors of the book, at the same sort of meeting point on the horseshoe as the MAGA Vice President, J.D. Vance. They are both pretty much saying the same thing. And if this was meant to knock Original Sin, the book, off its sort of, perch, I don't think it will. I think it will absolutely fuel book sales now because everyone is kind of asking the same question, which is, who did know what? Who turned a blind eye? Was there any lie to the public? And how have we ended up now in a place where the man who should be so well looked after, I mean so well cared for, as the most important figure in America, was somehow able to go undiagnosed up until this point with what is now looking like terminal cancer?
I think that the question that kind of attaches most closely is to some of the people that were around Joe Biden. And yeah, you can point to people like Blinken, who was the Secretary of State, or Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. But, the thing that was always said to me was that the closest people to Biden were his sister and his wife, Jill, and the rest of the Biden family. They would go off for Thanksgiving, or they would go off for Easter break, and they would decide whether he was running again or whether he wasn't running again. That was the inner circle. And I think within that inner circle, and you remember Jill Biden after the terrible, catastrophic CNN debate, was the one saying, Joe, you were fantastic. You answered every question. You knocked it out of the park, when it was so obvious that he hadn't. It was so obvious that it had been a catastrophe.
Yeah. It was
and
awful to watch that.
And I think some of those people really do need to answer some pretty searching questions about why they thought it would be okay for him to run for a second term.
Yeah, well, our guest today is someone who has known Joe Biden and his family nearly 40 years. It's Jamie Rubin. He's the co-host of Christian Amanpour Presents The X-Files with Jamie Rubin, which is launched in the past week. But he was also, critically, a top advisor and a strategist for Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, until the election. He focused on Russia-Ukraine, and he also worked very closely in the Bill Clinton administration, as an advisor on Middle East affairs. And so today we're going to talk to Jamie about who knew what in the administration around Biden, and about the policy that involves these wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine. And we're also going to mention the strange question of James Comey, former FBI chief, and those seashells that spelled out what Trump's team thinks was an order to kill. We're going to be talking now to James Rubin, Jamie Rubin. He is the co-host of Christian Amanpour Presents The X-Files with Jamie Rubin, but he is also a man who has been at the heart of several US Democrat institutions. He was a top advisor and strategist for Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State under Joe Biden, and worked very closely with the Clinton administration at all. And Jamie, we've got to start with where you are right now, because this is probably the most famous kitchen, or the most famous...
Woman's kitchen.
Go on, tell us where you are.
All right, behind me is a kitchen in a house which I own, and it was previously owned by Edie Falco, who is better known as Carmela Soprano. And pretty much all of the Soprano episodes were in the kitchen with Tony eating out of the refrigerator. And so I think she made her kitchen particularly good. And so that's Carmela's kitchen, according to my family.
So basically a mafia kitchen.
Well, you know, we do business, but we don't take it personally.
So we've basically got a choice now. We can spend the next 15 minutes dissecting The Sopranos, or we can dissect American politics. I think we've got to go for the latter, although I think we'd love to dwell on The Sopranos because it was absolutely brilliant. Look,
We'll do that next time.
Next time. Let's start, though, with the sad announcement that came this week that Joe Biden has stage 4 prostate cancer, and it has metastasized and has gone to his bones. And you would think that the only natural reaction is one of concern and best wishes and all the rest of it. And it feels like it's gone in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, that is unfortunate. Look, first of all, I've known Joe Biden, as Emily and I figured out as we were talking, 37 years. I knew him as a young man. I started working for him on arms control during the Cold War when he was a senator. I've known him through all of his personal tragedies. When I first started working for him, he had a brain aneurysm and went into surgery and was unavailable for 8 months. He obviously started his professional career when he got in his wife got in a car accident and he lost his wife and son. So this is a man who's been through numerous tragedies, numerous ups and downs in his political career. And unfortunately, as you say, instead of people feeling sorry for a person who's facing a life-threatening illness, it's back to conspiracy theories. When did he know? When did he know it? Why didn't we know? And all of that. And since I know that is the question of the day, let me just address it and then take any other questions you might have. As it happens, I did not work with him directly during the last 2 years of the Biden administration. I worked with Tony Blinken, who was the Secretary of State. And Tony and I are very good friends, and he asked me to join, and I spent those 2 years by his side. He worked with the president. I spoke to him this week about President Biden and about his relationship with him, because that's the issue of the day. And I would boil it down to the following. Tony did not feel during his 4 years working with Joe Biden on foreign policy directly and constantly that there was ever a time that Senator and then President Biden, I call him Senator still because of those old days, never a time when his health interfered with his ability to make the important decisions for our country. Did that mean he was performing at a perfect level every day for those 4 years? Clearly not. We all saw that in a debate when he did not perform up to snuff. But as far as those 4 years when he was in office, I don't believe that his health was a factor. It was a factor in whether he should run again. And that's something we might talk about, and a lot of people are talking about. But in terms of the decisions he made, and in terms of whether he made good decisions, I'd take Joe Biden on and off as an elderly man over Donald Trump any day of the week, because he made decisions that were good for our country internationally, where I know something about it, where he was building an alliance in Europe, building an alliance in Asia, and frankly, bringing our Asian and European alliances together. That's never happened before. So we were building a world alliance of democratic and countries that believe in the rules and rights. Donald Trump has a very different view. I don't agree with it. Some people do. And so I'd prefer a Biden weakened by age, making good decisions, than a Donald Trump as active as he is, making bad decisions. I'm
Jamie,
a Democrat. I would say that.
yeah, of
but
course.
That's my opinion.
I want to unpick some stuff with you because it's deeply uncomfortable. I mean, it's really uncomfortable to talk about. But I think if we don't, then we're probably not doing the subject justice. Exactly. And as you will know, the cancer diagnosis came out on Sunday night in the middle of quite a raft of publicity about a new book, Original Sin, which is out today, which describes all the Democrats who the authors say basically shielded Biden or covered up Biden's inability, cognitive difficulties and all the rest of it. And inevitably, there are some voices now saying that this diagnosis was too weirdly timed for it to be coincidence. Now, I guess, you have to weigh that up against, well, why would anyone conceal a stage 4 cancer diagnosis? It would be inconceivable to have that and not actually get treatment for it instead of kind of, concealing it. But what are you making of the timing? And presumably you're talking to Jill Biden at the moment, and presumably you're talking to the former president himself, and understand a little bit about the worries now, which is, where does the cover-up begin and where does it end, and what is cover-up and what is absolute kind of crazy-ass conspiracy?
Well, I think we're going to be talking about that. Everybody's going to talk about that. Unfortunately, that's become a topic. I don't know the answer to those questions, Emily. I'll be frank with you. I don't talk to Joe Biden every day now. I did know him very, very well from 1988 through 1993. I was his closest advisor. I met him on and off through the 90s and the 2000s. My ex-wife and I went to his house, spent time with his Jill Biden. He met our son. But my personal relationship with Joe Biden sort of ended in roughly the 2010 period. So I don't have a day-to-day relationship. So I did call Tony Blinken, who does, and asked him about this. And he wasn't aware, or certainly didn't tell me anything about any cancer diagnosis. And I think people are going to examine it, and at some point the facts will come out. I agree with you. Timing is odd. Who can doubt that? But nevertheless, I would like to try, to the extent we can, to focus on two separate issues and distinguish between them, which was his performance in office, the decisions he made, and the consequences of those decisions.
I mean, what did Tony Blinken say about that? Did he?
He told me that very frankly, that whether it was war and peace, like the Israelis about to bomb Iran, which was putting at risk a Gulf war between the Iranians and the Saudis, and we had to provide defense systems to the Israelis, and we were negotiating with them. He told me very clearly that he never felt that Joe Biden's aging interfered with his decision making process, that Tony never felt that. And I believe him. This is an honest man. Did Biden perform communicatively? Did he walk properly? All of those things. And here's where I'd like to make the third point. Everybody knew this was an old man. When he was elected in 2020, he was an old man. And people knew he was an old man, and they voted for him anyway.
But Jamie, do you think that somebody of Tony Blinken's stature, somebody who was outside the family, but very close and very involved in the administration, should have been more forthright at the time? I mean, you say that Biden stepped down. He didn't really. He failed a public national TV test. Okay, after a debate showed it to the world.
Emily, now come on. He stepped down, but not as early as probably our politics should have required.
So what should Blinken have done then? That's my question. Should Blinken or others like him have been bolder in what they saw?
I'm not going to second guess people's behavior at this point. All I know is that Joe Biden has to make these decisions for himself. He was shielded. I know the way senators work. The man was a senator since age 29. Yeah. He had a buffer system his whole life. When I worked closely with him, I wasn't in his inner circle. There were 3 levels between me and him. There was his sister, there was his wife, there were the close political advisors, and then there were the people who gave him advice on policy. And when he was ready to see us, the door opened.
But Jamie,
And we came in and we talked to him. And before that, the door was closed, and I didn't know what happened when he ran for office and when he had, brain aneurysm. And I didn't talk to him about his wife's dying in a car wreck. That wasn't our relationship. There are people who had that relationship, and they should be asked those questions. Well, Tony Blinken didn't have that relationship. He was Secretary of State. He was his closest foreign policy advisor. And if he's telling me that he never felt he couldn't get decisions out of the president when he needed them, I believe him.
But then why? Why do you think it is that Jill Biden, his sister, didn't call out and say, look, you said you'd only be a one-term president. If that's the case, leave the space for someone else to come in. He was forced out in the end when it became unconscionable that he would be the candidate.
Yes, you're right. And they have to answer those questions. And I can't give you answers. I'm not one of these people who speculates and loves to have their voices out there on things they don't know. Sure. I like to talk about what I know, what I've observed, and my judgment about policy. That's what I do for a living. Yeah. Okay. There are other people who have to answer those questions. Yeah, and it's not me. I'm sorry. I can't give you all those answers, but I can't.
I understand. But there are other bits that have come out in the Jake Tapper book where, he didn't recognise Clooney at the fundraiser and had to be jolted his memory who he was. Maybe let's put that one to one side. But he also didn't recognise Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor. Now, that's someone who is playing an absolutely critical role in the administration. If that isn't ringing alarm bells, what is?
Fair enough. You can ask Jake Sullivan about it. I spoke to Tony Blinken, who was a much closer advisor to Joe Biden than Jake Sullivan was. He was his longest term foreign policy advisor. Now, granted, half of his time was spent traveling around the world, and most of his contact with the president was on the telephone. But they had regular lunches. You saw each other. I believe it's been reported that at one of those lunches, Tony Blinken said to him, you need to think about what your legacy is going to be and whether you run for office, and you should make that decision. So I think Tony did what he should have done with the president. And I feel comfortable saying that. Whether others did what they ought to have done, I don't know. But I would ask you to remember that he did step down, that it's not obvious that a different Democrat would have beaten Trump. And some of this self-flagellation by the Democratic Party, I think, is unjustified. It's not obvious that any Democrat would have beaten Trump. And since I know something about politics, I would offer the following. Had he stepped down in February or January or the year before, and we had gone through a primary system, we might have been worse off because our party tends to veer left in primaries. The reason Joe Biden became the candidate in 2020 wasn't because he ran a brilliant campaign. It was because the voters looked at the candidates out there and said, oh my God, none of them can beat Trump. And they voted for him en masse because he was even though he was an old man. And so let me end this point, and I'm happy to answer. But to me, it's just as plausible that we would have had a great candidate and beaten Trump, that we would have had a worse candidate than Kamala Harris only running for a shorter campaign. And we would have gone farther to the left, and we might have gotten slaughtered even worse. And so sometimes there's this tendency to assume that had he stepped down in January, February, we would have this great primary, and then we would have this great candidate, and then we would have beaten Trump. Not clear at all, given the direction of the country and the polls that were out there. And it's just, it seems to me unfortunate that we're not judging the 4-year presidency of Biden for what he did, for the performance of his policies, and instead, and that's what I do. I'm a policy guy. I'm not a politician per se. I know in Britain the difference is subtle, but I'm not a politician. And so I judge the policies of Biden, and I think our country was better off with those policies. I think the world was better off with those policies. And all of you in Europe who are, worried about the role of the United States in the Trump era might remember that a weakened Biden was much better for Europe than a fully fledged Trump who is pushing for decoupling, essentially,
Yeah.
the American security umbrella.
You used the word legacy a moment ago. And I wonder, it's very difficult, isn't it, to be the president who hasn't got enough time behind him to, in a way, curate and shape that legacy. Do you think? I mean, if you compare him to somebody like Carter, who had as much time after he was president to sort of remind people of what he did and the philanthropy and really to sort of, recreate the person he was, it's going to be very different with Biden, isn't it? Who will
Right.
presumably not have that long to rewrite the legacy. I wonder how that
And
will
it'll
be
be
written.
rewritten. Yeah, I mean, you're right. And it'll be rewritten in a completely partisan, hyper extreme moment. Jimmy Carter, when he left office, was a disgraced president, a
Yeah.
one-term disgraced president who basically fell because of the hostages
Yeah.
and was thought of as a weak and flawed man. Over time, as you say, his policies came to be viewed in retrospect: Camp David peace accords, the Panama Canal treaties, the entry of human rights into our foreign policy,
Exactly.
and all the work that he did made people remember his presidency with some fondness. Now, Biden is going to have that time. You're absolutely right. That's why I just would hope, especially because remember, we're dealing with a time in history that it gets lost. We have a moment where Russia is running amok with hundreds of thousands of troops invading its neighbor, supported by a country of 1 billion people that is engaged in the largest military buildup in history. That is the People's Republic of China. More ships, more nuclear forces. And one of the most famous questions I've ever heard is, what is this military buildup for? And so we face a dangerous world out there with Russia and China uniting essentially in an alliance. They don't want to call it that, but it is. And instead of self-flagellating on what should or would have happened had Biden left a little bit earlier, I'd like to think that we could focus on how Europe, the United States, and Asia can stand up to this mega challenge we're going to face for the rest of my life.
So let me talk about one of the policy areas that
Sure.
I think that is fascinating now and horrifying simultaneously, which is what is happening in Gaza, the attitude of the Israeli government, which has been obviously to have a blockade of aid going into Gaza for nearly 12 weeks now. You've seen Britain, France and Canada issue a statement condemning what Netanyahu is doing. Where do you think Trump is? Because it is beginning to look like Trump, too, is growing exasperated with Netanyahu and kind of, he was in the Middle East last week, didn't go there.
I wouldn't bet on it. Right now, the way I would interpret this is that President Trump concluded there wasn't much to be gained by trying to make peace in Gaza, because it isn't going to happen anytime soon. And he was better off focusing on business, which is what he loves to do. And he did business in Qatar, he did business in Saudi Arabia, he did business in the UAE, and he was able to present a happy future for the world. But if you're just thinking that Donald Trump and his administration are broken with Israel, which I know a lot of people are saying right now, they're engaging what I would call wishful thinking when it comes to the question of where the embassy should be, when it comes to the question of whether Israel should be forced to not fight Hamas in Gaza. Remember that President Trump proposed something that was horrifying to the world, which was the removal of all the Palestinians from Gaza and sending them off to Egypt or Jordan or some other place. That's the worst version of peace in the Middle East I've ever heard. Does President Trump want to focus on Gaza peace deal making right now? No. And you know why? Because he's not prepared to break with Netanyahu. He's not prepared to withhold weaponry from Netanyahu. He's not prepared to say it's time to come up with a long-term solution for Gaza. And here's another case. Joe Biden was. I know he was criticized for giving too much to the Israelis, but he authorized me and Tony Blinken to come up with a plan to end the war And we were going to force that on the Israelis. We were going to persuade them that they needed to accept the United States calling for a Palestinian state, for the Israelis to remove all of their forces from Gaza, to put in place an international force that would enable Hamas to be prevented from rebuilding, and then to get the great Saudi peace deal. That's what we were working on. But that required you to break with the Israelis on what they can and can't do in Gaza, whether they can occupy it, whether their troops can stay there indefinitely. And Trump, yes, he got the American hostage out. Yes, he's talking about a deal with Iran. But if you think that he's about to withhold weapons from Israel for their offensive in Gaza, and that he's breaking with the Israelis, I would ask you to think again. The Republican Party itself, and Donald Trump in particular, has a full alignment with the Israeli government on policies regarding Israel and the Palestinians. And that has not changed in the last 2 weeks.
Look, you said something fascinating there, that you were planning to force the Israelis. I just wonder what, literally, I wonder what does that mean? How do you force the Israelis? How do you force Netanyahu?
First of all, I probably overstated it, and let me scale it back a little bit, because force normally means withholding aid, sanctions, breaking with the government. No American government is going to do that with Israel. But there are ways in which you can pressure, is probably a better word, the Israelis, by putting out in front of the Israeli people the prospect that they could get peace with Saudi Arabia, that they could get the war in Gaza to end, get the hostages released, and all the Israelis would have to do would be to remove their forces from Gaza and allow an international force to be between them and the Palestinians at the various borders, so Hamas couldn't rebuild by importing new weaponry. And that was something they would not prefer, but once the United States put that idea forward, they knew that the Israeli public would be for that. If they could know that they could end the war, get the hostages back, know that Hamas wasn't going to be rebuilt, and the only price they'd have to pay was the United States saying this was the first step towards a Palestinian state, and the benefit they were going to get was a peace deal with Saudi Arabia. I believe the Israeli public would support that. I think Netanyahu was afraid of that, and that's why he continued to negotiate with us to see whether he could run the clock out, and the election ran the clock out on us. And once the election happened and we lost our leverage, and he was waiting for Trump because he knows that on the substance, look at the people he's appointed to the policies related to the Israelis, and you'll see people who advocated moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is something no previous administration wanted to do because it would alienate the Palestinians and the Arabs. So yes, he's avoiding Netanyahu right now, and I think that's a fair observation. And he's doing what's good for the United States with the American hostage. But to think that means we're breaking with the Israelis, which is what everyone is implying, and frankly, a lot of people are hoping, is I think, is not so.
Let me turn you to another war then, Jamie. After a 2-hour phone call between Putin and Trump, do you see any optimism there, or do you think Trump is walking away from that one?
Well, I'm optimistic because I'm optimistic that President Trump has finally come to the conclusion that, one, this war wasn't going to be so easy to end, and two, that maybe, just maybe, pressuring Zelensky is not the solution to this problem. Remember, this meeting and discussion with Putin is, I guess, their third call, but this came after the president, actually humiliated the Ukrainian president in the Oval Office, the victim of an aggression. Yeah. Remember, the first commandment of international affairs, thou shalt not invade thy neighbor. That's what's happened here. And I think President Trump is realizing that, maybe Putin doesn't want to stop the war. Maybe this isn't going to be able to be done in one day. I think the war goes on. I think until Putin, look, our strategy was very simple. We needed to win the election. We needed to show Putin that he faced 4 more years at least of an American government fully supportive of the Ukrainians, a European continent fully supportive of the Ukrainians, a Ukrainian people rebuilding their country, their military industries, their fighting capability. And until Putin realizes that's what he's facing, I don't believe he's going to make any reasonable adjustment in his position that will allow for a peace process. So the answer is the war goes on. The only reason I'm optimistic, not because I want the war to go on, but because the pressuring of Ukraine is going to stop. And the only issue remaining will be, will the United States support Ukraine militarily? And here's where I'd like to throw an idea out that I hope Trump hears. He's been very, very good at pressuring Europe to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, spending money on defense, standing up and defending Ukraine. Well, why doesn't he force the Europeans, pressure the Europeans to spend these billions of dollars on American weapons, the weapons that Ukraine needs? You know, one of the ironies is that the only industry President Trump doesn't seem to want to promote in the United States is the defense industry. We need a bigger defense budget, and we instead of avoiding giving aid to Ukraine, remember that Ukrainian aid we gave all went into the pockets of the defense contractors because it was for American weapons. We should be giving aid to Ukraine. They're fighting Russians. That is reducing the risk that we face someday. And we could force the Europeans to spend half of those billions of dollars, whatever it is, several hundred billion, on American weapons that Ukraine needs, whether that's Patriot missiles, whether that's ATACMS missiles, whatever it is, instead of just alienating Europeans, so they're afraid of buying American weapons, and they're going to build up their own defense industry.
Well, exactly.
We'd be better off.
I think the Europeans are much happier, much more confident spending defense spending on their own.
Except they know that it'll take a long time to rebuild that industry.
Jamie, listen.
It'll be harder.
We're almost out of time, but just before we go, there's a really strange story which we explained earlier.
I sounds like I haven't prepared for this one.
You know, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's James Comey and the seashells on the beach.
Right.
And the fact he was pulled in for questioning because they thought it was potentially treasonous.
Look, our country has started to behave a little strangely. It's not a happy thing. I'm not happy about it. Whether it's people, who are students at Columbia called in for questioning because of something they wrote or said, whether it's students who protested, expressing their freedom of information rights, freedom of the press, all of those things, bringing people in. Look, it's getting a little weird. Basically, weaponizing our Justice Department. Weaponizing the Secret Service, I guess, in this case. Look, there are Secret Service men who are probably, doing their jobs, thinking that anytime there's a threat to the president, they're supposed to inquire about it. Of course, we know that James Comey would never be involved in something like that. But James Comey is a famous political enemy of the president. So it's kind of a weird story. I agree with you. Whether Comey knew what he was saying about 86, the president, I don't know. It doesn't really matter to me. 86 is a word we used in a restaurant for we've run out of, tomatoes. 86 the tomatoes. You could use that word many different ways. This is one of those cases where America is going a little strange. I'm not proud of it. And hopefully it will desist at some point.
Incredible. Great to have you on, Jamie, and best of luck with the launch. Yeah, come back.
Well, if I can come back, I'll sit in that middle chair right there.
Yeah,
it's got your name on it.
It's got your name.
Okay, take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye for now. So I did mention the prize for the strangest story of the week goes to James Comey and the seashells. Now, to put this in context, James Comey was the former FBI chief who was fired by Trump. And James Comey, who I interviewed shortly after that, said his biggest fear is that Trump will come after his political enemies. He counted himself and his family amongst them. Just put that thought on one side, because over the weekend, Comey Instagrammed a picture of seashells on the beach that were in the formation of numbers 8647. And these numbers, when they appeared on Instagram, spelled out to people who read more significance into numbers than we certainly do, 86 as a kill order and 47 as the number of the presidency. In other words, Trump. And it went so far that Comey was actually called in for questioning on suspicion that he was trying to stage some kind of plot to execute or get rid of Donald Trump. In other words, everything that Comey had originally feared would happen. Now, he went on TV, on NBC, early today to, there's no other way of saying this, blame his wife.
You are back in the middle of a political firestorm.
Yeah, for walking on the beach with my wife. So I don't know how we ended up here. It never occurred to me that it was any kind of controversial thing, but that's the time we live in.
So take me back to the walk on the beach.
We were walking on the beach. We went to the beach to prepare for this week, which was the launch of my book, and to think about the book and to prepare to answer questions about it. And we were walking back towards the road, and we saw in the sand someone had arranged shells with numbers. And Patrice, my wife, said, why would someone put an address in the sand? And I said, I don't know. And we stood over it, and I said, I think it's some kind of like political message. And she said, 86, when I was a server, she did a lot of work in restaurants, meant to remove an item from the menu when you ran out of ingredients. And I said, well, to me, as a kid, it always meant to leave a place, to ditch a place. I said, that's really clever. So then she said, you should take a picture of that. And I did. And I posted it on my Instagram account and thought nothing more of it until I heard through her that people were saying it was some sort of a call for assassination, which is crazy. But I took it down. Even if I think it's crazy, I don't want to be associated with violence of any kind.
And we'll be back next week without seashells, without discussing a Sopranos kitchen. We started with mafia kind of suggestions of a hit squad.
Bookended by mafia. Perfect.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents USA.